What if the biggest blow to Russia isn't happening on the front line at all, but somewhere Putin never expected, deep inside his own country, where ordinary people are starting to feel a war he promised them would never touch their daily lives? There's a countdown running right now that almost nobody outside Ukraine is talking about. And once you understand what happens when it hits zero, you'll understand exactly why Russia is starting to panic behind closed doors. Before we get into it, if you want to actually understand this war instead of just seeing scattered headlines, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who thinks this war has gone quiet, because it hasn't. It's just moved somewhere Russia can't hide it anymore. A little over a month ago, Ukraine's president stood up and announced something that sounded almost like a dare. A 40-day window. A period of intense, sustained pressure aimed directly at forcing Russia to finally stop this war. At the time, plenty of people treated it as just another political statement, the kind of thing leaders say to sound strong without much actually changing behind the scenes. But this time was different, because Ukraine wasn't just talking. It was already building the machine needed to back that statement up with real physical consequences. We are now well past the halfway point of that window, deep into the 30s on that countdown, and Russia still hasn't blinked. Which means, according to Ukraine's own leadership, the campaign isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. A new target list has already been drawn up for Ukraine's long-range drone forces, and the message coming out of Kyiv is simple and blunt. The strikes continue. To really understand how serious this has become, you need to look at the bigger picture first, because the scale of what Ukraine has actually accomplished this year is honestly staggering, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. Independent trackers monitoring Ukrainian strikes inside Russian territory have put together a detailed map covering the first 7 months of this year alone. And the numbers on that map tell a story that Russian state media desperately wants to keep hidden from its own population. Dozens of strikes on oil refineries spread across more than 24 separate facilities. Dozens more strikes on oil storage depots. Attacks on export terminals that Russia depends on to move its most valuable resource out of the country. Strikes on metallurgy plants, gas infrastructure, defense manufacturing sites, chemical facilities, and fuel pumping stations that keep the entire Russian logistics network moving. This isn't a handful of symbolic attacks meant to grab headlines for a day and then fade away. This is a sustained, methodical campaign, hitting the exact infrastructure that keeps Russia's war machine and its civilian economy running side by side. And here's the part that matters most. Russia keeps absorbing these hits and keeps pretending, publicly at least, that none of it matters. But the truth underneath that performance tells a very different story. For the first few years of this war, a lot of ordinary Russians were able to live their lives almost completely disconnected from what was happening. The fighting was far away. The casualties were reported in vague, sanitized numbers, if they were reported at all. Life in major Russian cities went on largely as normal. But that separation is breaking down now, piece by piece, because Ukraine has built something Russia genuinely did not expect. A domestic drone and missile production capability strong enough to reach deep inside Russian territory, again and again, without needing to rely on anyone else's weapons or anyone else's permission. And Ukraine isn't just hitting military targets anymore, it's hitting the exact things that make daily life in Russia feel normal, comfortable, and predictable. And that shift is turning out to be one of the smartest strategic decisions of this entire war. Take something as simple as online shopping. Millions of Russians rely on massive e-commerce platforms for everyday deliveries, the same way people in most countries rely on major online retailers. These platforms depend on huge distribution warehouses to function, giant hubs where packages get sorted and sent out across the country. Ukraine has started systematically targeting exactly these hubs. In a single week, drone strikes reportedly knocked out roughly a fifth of one major distribution network's total storage capacity. Not damaged, not slowed down, wiped out in the span of 7 days. Think about what that actually means for an ordinary Russian family. The war used to be something they watched on television, something happening to soldiers far away. Now it's something that shows up as a missing package, a delayed delivery, an empty shelf where a familiar product used to be. That kind of disruption reaches people in a way that abstract casualty numbers never could. It makes the war personal, immediate, and impossible to ignore, even for people who spent years choosing not to think about it. And this pattern is repeating itself again and again across different targets. Another major warehouse complex near Moscow went up in flames recently, not the primary distribution center this time, but a neighboring facility that appeared to be storing something Ukraine considered important enough to destroy anyway. Whatever intelligence led to that specific target, the result was the same. Another storage facility reduced to ash, deep inside Russia's own capital region, far from anything resembling a traditional front line. Now, you might be wondering how Ukraine keeps pulling this off so consistently, hitting targets deep inside a country with one of the largest air defense networks in the world. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because open source researchers using publicly available satellite imagery have actually mapped out Russia's entire radar and air defense coverage. And what that map reveals is almost embarrassing for a country that spends so heavily on military spending. Russia's most advanced long-range air defense systems are heavily clustered around a small handful of high-priority locations. Moscow, unsurprisingly, is blanketed in coverage. Certain southern port cities get dense protection too, but once you move outside those specific pockets, the coverage thins out dramatically, leaving enormous gaps across the rest of the country. Ukraine's newer long-range cruise missiles reportedly fly flight paths that thread directly through these gaps, slipping past expensive defense systems that were simply never positioned to cover that particular airspace in the first place. It's not that Russia has no air defense. It's that Russia built its air defense to protect a handful of symbolic, high-value locations, while leaving vast stretches of its own industrial and economic infrastructure essentially exposed. And Ukraine, with patient reconnaissance and careful planning, has been exploiting that exact weakness for months. One of the men closely associated with building this capability has become something of a public figure lately, regularly giving interviews about what comes next. He's described the current strategy in blunt, almost business-like terms. Fuel prices in Moscow have reportedly climbed to several times their normal cost. People are being forced to wait in long lines just to fill up their vehicles, an experience that would have been almost unthinkable in the Russian capital a few years ago. And according to him, the plan now is to finish the job on these major e-commerce warehouses, then move on to the next big distribution platform entirely. Why does this matter so much economically? Because these massive online retail platforms aren't just convenient shopping apps. They're deeply tied into Russia's banking system. Countless businesses have taken out substantial loans specifically to stock inventory inside these warehouses. When that inventory gets destroyed by a drone strike and there's typically no meaningful insurance covering losses caused by military action, those loans don't disappear. To secure it are now gone. Multiply that across dozens of destroyed warehouses, and you start to see the outline of a genuine structural threat to parts of Russia's banking sector, not from sanctions imposed by outside governments, but from direct physical destruction happening inside Russian borders. It's worth pausing here to look at how Russian state television is actually handling all of this, because the contrast between reality and the official narrative is honestly one of the more revealing parts of this entire story. State broadcasters can no longer simply pretend nothing is happening. Too many explosions, too many fires, too many ordinary Russians personally affected by missing deliveries and rising fuel prices. So instead, the narrative has shifted towards something almost comedic in its desperation. Recent state television commentary has leaned heavily into a specific talking point: absurdly high numbers of supposedly intercepted Ukrainian drones, thousands of them in a single week, according to their own reporting, alongside claims that all of these weapons are actually being secretly manufactured somewhere in Western Europe, rather than inside Ukraine itself. The implication being pushed is that Ukraine simply isn't capable of building this kind of capability on its own, that some hidden European factory must be responsible instead. It's a strange kind of narrative to lean into, because if you genuinely believe your own air defense is intercepting thousands of drones every single week, and yet somehow warehouses, refineries, and military facilities are still burning down across the country on a near-daily basis, that story starts to fall apart under its own weight pretty quickly. Ordinary Russians watching their own gas prices triple, not likely to keep buying that particular explanation for very much longer. If this deep dive into what's really happening inside Russia is opening your eyes to something the mainstream headlines keep missing, drop a comment and tell me which part surprised you most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to see the real picture, not just the sanitized version. Let's talk about the energy sector specifically, because this is where the pressure campaign has been most relentless and most effective. A major oil refinery located roughly 2,000 kilometers from the front line, well beyond what most people would consider a realistic strike range, was hit by Ukrainian drones and forced to completely suspend operations for repairs. 2,000 kilometers. That distance alone should tell you something about how far Ukraine's reach has genuinely extended. Export terminals along Russia's coastline have also come under repeated attack, disrupting the infrastructure Russia depends on to move oil out to international buyers. And in regions closer to the border, areas that see hundreds of drone strikes almost every single day, strikes are happening so constantly now that most individual attacks don't even make headlines anymore. They've simply become routine, a background hum of destruction that Russian officials would clearly prefer the rest of the world stop noticing. Even Russia's military aviation hasn't been immune to trouble, though not always from direct strikes. A military training jet reportedly crashed during a low-altitude maneuver, killing its pilots, a reminder that even away from the immediate chaos of strikes and explosions, The overall strain on Russia's military systems continues to show cracks in unexpected places. And then there's Crimea, which deserves its own separate conversation entirely, because what's happening there right now might be building toward one of the most significant moments of this entire war. The bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Russia has long stood as a symbol of the occupation itself, a physical, visible statement that Crimea belongs to Russia and always will. Ukraine has targeted it before, with limited success, but the current pattern of strikes suggests something more deliberate is being prepared this time. Ukrainian forces have been systematically targeting radar systems and air defense installations specifically positioned to protect that bridge, methodically clearing a path rather than launching a direct attack right away. According to statements from officials overseeing Ukraine's drone forces, the bridge itself hasn't been destroyed yet for a specific, calculated reason. Cutting off power, water, and fuel supplies to the Crimean Peninsula is intended to encourage civilians to leave the area voluntarily first. Reports suggest that in the initial days after these disruptions began, there were massive traffic backups of people trying to evacuate the peninsula, lines of cars stretching for kilometers. That backup has since cleared, which suggests most civilians who intended to leave have already done so. Given that timeline, and given the ongoing effort to systematically dismantle the bridge's air defense protection, there's a real possibility that a major strike on that bridge could be coming within the current window of this pressure campaign. If it happens, it would represent one of the most symbolically significant strikes of the entire war, a direct blow to the single most visible physical symbol of Russia's occupation. Meanwhile, inside Crimea itself, the systematic targeting of energy infrastructure has been relentless. Dozens of power facilities, substations, and transformers have reportedly been struck within just the last several days, part of a broader campaign aimed at making the occupied peninsula increasingly difficult to sustain. The specific numbers vary depending on the source, but the pattern is unmistakable. Crimea's power grid is being deliberately, methodically dismantled piece by piece. Now let's shift to something that might end up mattering more than any single strike, the growing fuel crisis affecting Russia's own military. This is the kind of story that doesn't always make dramatic headlines, but it has enormous long-term consequences for how this war actually unfolds on the ground. Reports emerging from soldiers themselves, shared through independent Russian news outlets willing to actually report honestly, describe a fuel shortage at the front lines that has become genuinely severe. Refined fuel is becoming scarce and increasingly expensive, and what little is available is reportedly being prioritized for vehicles officially owned by the state military, a policy that creates a massive problem given how much of Russia's actual battlefield transportation depends on privately owned vehicles. According to these reports, the vast majority of vehicles actually being used at the front, somewhere around 90% by some estimates, are privately owned, either brought by soldiers themselves or donated by families and communities back home. Under the current fuel prioritization policy, many of these vehicles simply aren't eligible for official fuel rations anymore. Soldiers are reportedly being limited to a strict daily allowance per vehicle, an allowance that, according to those interviewed, simply isn't enough to sustain normal operational activity. This matters enormously because it directly connects the strikes happening deep inside Russia to the actual battlefield reality soldiers are facing every single day. Every refinery that goes offline, every export terminal that gets disrupted, every depot that burns ripples outward until it eventually reaches a soldier sitting in a vehicle with an empty tank, unable to move, unable to resupply, unable to do much of anything. This is exactly the kind of slow compounding pressure that doesn't produce a single dramatic headline moment, stability over time in a way that's very difficult to reverse quickly. Even symbolic events inside Russia are starting to reflect this growing unease at the highest levels. A major annual naval celebration in St. Petersburg, historically one of the country's most prominent public military displays, has reportedly been scaled back or canceled for the second consecutive year. Instead of the usual large public gathering involving real naval vessels, reports describe a considerably more modest, distant event, with leadership reportedly making only brief, carefully controlled public appearances rather than the elaborate spectacle of previous years. When a government becomes visibly cautious about how, when, and where its own leadership appears in public, that tells you something meaningful about the underlying mood inside that government, regardless of what official statements claim. And speaking of official statements, Russian leadership has recently leaned into a renewed public messaging campaign, once again denying any responsibility for starting this war, framing the ongoing conflict as something forced upon Russia rather than a war of choice. Public appearances have increased, seemingly aimed at reassuring an increasingly anxious domestic population. Whether that messaging is landing effectively with ordinary Russians is genuinely difficult to say from the outside. But the sheer effort being put into managing public perception suggests leadership is well aware that confidence at home is beginning to genuinely waver. There's also growing discussion around a topic that touches an enormous number of Russian families directly, the possibility of a significant new wave of military mobilization. According to Ukrainian intelligence assessments shared publicly by government officials, Russian leadership is reportedly preparing to expand mobilization efforts sometime after upcoming parliamentary elections later this year, timing it carefully to avoid domestic backlash before that vote takes place. Estimates suggest this next wave could potentially involve several 100,000 additional people, a scale that would be difficult to disguise or downplay, even with tightly controlled state media coverage. Predictably, officials within Russia's own parliament have publicly denied any such plans are being considered, insisting that current voluntary recruitment methods remain fully sufficient to meet ongoing military needs. But independent analysts who track Russian military policy closely have pointed out something important. The original mobilization decree issued years ago at the start of the full invasion was technically never actually revoked. It has simply remained in effect quietly, largely unenforced at scale for an extended period. Under that framework, any meaningful change wouldn't necessarily require a dramatic new formal announcement at all. It would simply require enforcing existing legal authority more visibly and more aggressively than has been the recent pattern. If that expanded mobilization does move forward as anticipated, expect to see significant disruption around that time. Restricted internet access, tightened border controls, reports of men being detained in public spaces and directed toward military service centers with little advance warning. These aren't hypothetical predictions pulled from nowhere. They mirror patterns already observed during the initial mobilization wave several years ago, a period that triggered significant public unrest and a substantial wave of people leaving the country entirely rather than face conscription. Since we're deep into this story now, let me ask you something directly. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the real ground-level reality of this war, not just the surface-level headlines most people skim past. So do something simple for me right now. Hit like on this video. It's a small action, but it directly determines whether more people get to see stories like this one instead of shallow, oversimplified coverage. Let's shift now to something happening far from any battlefield, but potentially just as consequential for how this war ultimately concludes, the diplomatic and political developments currently unfolding. Recently, Ukraine's president traveled internationally for a series of meetings, including discussions in Washington. According to statements released afterward, the conversation covered both continued air defense support and the broader question of eventual peace negotiations. Notably, this particular meeting was handled quite differently from previous encounters, conducted privately, without the large press gatherings and live television coverage that have sometimes turned similar meetings into unpredictable public spectacles. That shift in approach appears deliberate, an attempt to keep discussions focused and constructive rather than risking public friction playing out in front of cameras. One particularly interesting detail from this meeting involves who was present, and perhaps more tellingly, who chose not to attend. Certain figures within the administration who have expressed more skeptical views toward continued support for Ukraine reportedly opted to attend a separate meeting scheduled at the same time, rather than participate in these discussions directly. Meanwhile, other senior officials, generally viewed as more supportive of Ukraine's position, were present throughout. These kinds of quiet scheduling choices often reveal more about internal political dynamics than any official public statement ever could. There's also been notable, somewhat unexpected commentary coming from political voices generally associated with more skeptical positions on continued foreign involvement, publicly and specifically urging expanded weapon support for Ukraine, including advanced air defense systems. Whatever the underlying motivation behind that particular messaging, the practical result has been additional public pressure pushing in a direction that genuinely benefits Ukraine's position. And that shift is worth acknowledging honestly, regardless of the politics surrounding it. Perhaps most significantly, there are indications that senior administration officials, including individuals who have made repeated visits to Moscow for direct meetings with Russian leadership over an extended period, may soon make their first ever visit to Kiev as part of ongoing diplomatic efforts. If that visit actually takes place as currently planned, it would represent a meaningful, tangible shift. Officials who have spent considerable time engaging directly with the Russian perspective, finally experiencing the Ukrainian side of this conflict firsthand, seeing the actual damage, meeting the actual people living through it every single day. That kind of direct, personal exposure tends to shift perspectives in ways that reports and briefings simply cannot replicate. On a different note, international support continues arriving in smaller but genuinely meaningful ways as well. Specialized emergency response equipment has recently been donated from European partners specifically to support Ukraine's civilian emergency services. A reminder that support for Ukraine isn't limited to just weapons and ammunition. It also includes the everyday tools needed to protect and care for civilian populations, dealing with the constant aftermath of this war. And finally, There's been a clear, direct message from the newly appointed leadership in the United Kingdom, delivered during a recent visit from Ukraine's president. The message was notably direct and unambiguous, emphasizing full continued commitment to supporting Ukraine for as long as necessary, honoring every existing agreement completely, and making clear that this particular partnership isn't going anywhere, regardless of how long this conflict ultimately continues. So where does all of this actually leave us when you step back and look at the complete picture rather than just individual pieces? Your support helps us continue producing thoughtful, research-based coverage that focuses on understanding events instead of chasing headlines. For now, one conclusion stands above all others. The situation around Comar has evolved into far more than a local engagement. It has become a test of planning, endurance, adaptability, leadership, and logistics. Whatever happens next will likely influence not only nearby operations, but also the strategic calculations made by commanders on both sides. And as every new day brings fresh information, one thing is certain: the story is still unfolding. The next report could confirm expectations, or it could completely change the picture once again. As the world watches these developments, it is important to remember that wars are rarely decided by a single battle. Even the most successful operation is only one chapter in a much larger story. Every commander understands that today's victory can become tomorrow's challenge if momentum is not maintained. That is exactly why the next phase around Comar may be even more important than the advances already reported. Once new positions are secured, attention immediately shifts toward strengthening them. Defensive trenches must be improved. Observation posts need to be established. Supply routes have to remain open 24 hours a day. Engineers inspect roads and bridges, while logistics teams work almost nonstop to keep ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies moving forward. Without this support, even the most successful advance can quickly lose its effectiveness. This is often the part of warfare that receives the least public attention. Headlines usually focus on dramatic footage of explosions or advancing troops. Yet behind every successful operation are thousands of people working far from the front line. Mechanics repair damaged vehicles. Medical personnel treat wounded soldiers. Intelligence analysts examine satellite images. Drone operators monitor movement for hours without interruption. Each role contributes to the larger mission. Meanwhile, both sides continue learning from every engagement. Every successful tactic is carefully studied. Every mistake becomes a lesson. Every unexpected development forces commanders to adjust future plans. This constant process of adaptation explains why modern conflicts evolve so rapidly. Strategies that worked several months ago may no longer produce the same results today. Technology continues changing. Equipment improves. Countermeasures become more effective. Battlefield conditions evolve almost daily. That is why flexibility has become one of the most valuable qualities any military force can possess. Looking specifically toward Commander Drapati, expectations will likely continue growing. Leadership during periods of momentum requires discipline. There will always be pressure to move faster, pressure to achieve larger gains, pressure to capitalize immediately on every opportunity. But experienced commanders understand that preserving combat effectiveness often matters more than chasing headlines. Successful campaigns depend on consistency rather than isolated victories, steady progress, reliable logistics, strong coordination, effective communication. These factors frequently determine long-term success more than dramatic breakthroughs. Another major challenge involves maintaining morale. Soldiers need confidence in their leadership. Families need hope. Citizens want reassurance that sacrifices have meaning. Maintaining morale is not achieved through speeches alone. It comes from preparation, from trust, from leadership making informed decisions even under enormous pressure. At the same time, international observers continue monitoring how broader geopolitical developments may influence future operations. Military assistance, economic cooperation, industrial production, training programs, diplomatic negotiations. Each of these factors contributes to the overall strategic picture. The battlefield does not exist separately from politics or economics. Instead, all three remain closely connected. Every decision made far from the front can eventually influence conditions on the ground. That reality makes predicting future developments extremely difficult. Unexpected events can change priorities almost overnight. A technological breakthrough, a political decision, a logistical improvement. Any one of these could reshape operational planning. This uncertainty reminds us why responsible analysis should always avoid absolute predictions. Instead of claiming certainty, careful observers examine probabilities. They identify trends. They compare evidence. They acknowledge what remains unknown. That approach provides a much clearer understanding than relying on dramatic headlines alone. As reports continue arriving from multiple directions, analysts will keep watching whether the pressure around Comar expands into neighboring sectors or remains concentrated around its current objectives. The answer will become clearer only with time. Until then, patience remains one of the most valuable tools for understanding the conflict. If today's update helped you better understand the situation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with others who appreciate clear, balanced reporting. Every bit of support helps this channel continue bringing thoughtful analysis instead of unnecessary sensationalism. Looking back at everything we've discussed today, one theme stands out above all others. This is not simply a story about one village. It is a story about adaptation, leadership, technology, logistics, endurance, and the constant struggle to stay one step ahead in one of the most closely watched conflicts in the world. Whether recent reports ultimately mark the beginning of a larger operational shift, or simply another phase of an ongoing campaign, they remind us that even small developments can carry enormous strategic importance. Every movement on the battlefield creates new questions. Every decision shapes future possibilities. Every day adds another chapter to a conflict that continues to evolve in unexpected ways. As new information becomes available, analysts, governments, and millions of viewers around the world will continue following events closely, searching for signs that reveal where the conflict may be heading next. For now, one thing remains beyond doubt. The situation continues changing. The challenges facing commanders remain immense. The decisions made today will influence tomorrow's battlefield. And until clearer answers emerge, careful observation, verified information, and thoughtful analysis will remain more valuable than speculation. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Stay informed, stay curious. Take care of yourselves and those around you. And we'll be back very soon with another detailed update as this important story continues to unfold.